The ascent to the Aiguille du Midi was not merely a journey through altitude, but a steady dissolution of the world as Cyprian Gaunt knew it. As the cable car swayed with a rhythmic metallic groan, the lush valleys of Chamonix were swallowed by a vertical desert of ice and granite. Gaunt stood near the glass pane, his breath creating a fleeting shroud of mist against the window. He was a man of angular proportions, his face composed of sharp lines and deep-set eyes that seemed to dissect the landscape with the precision of a cartographer. To his left, the other guests of the Glass Observatory sat in a silence that was less about reverence for the scenery and more about the suffocating weight of their own expectations. The Glass Observatory itself was a triumph of architectural hubris. Anchored to the jagged peak like a crystalline parasite, it served as both a sanctuary for the celestial obsessed and a playground for the obscenely wealthy. As the car docked into the station with a jarring thud of steel on steel, the air changed. It became thin, sharp, and possessed of a crystalline purity that made one's lungs ache with the novelty of it. "A marvelous cage, is it not, Mr. Gaunt?" The voice belonged to Leopold Thistlewood. He stood by the exit, leaning heavily on a cane topped with a silver hawk's head. Thistlewood was a man who seemed to have been carved from old oak and cured in expensive cigar smoke. His presence was a gravitational force, dragging the attention of everyone in the room toward his tailored wool coat and the arrogant tilt of his chin. He represented the zenith of British industrial old money, the kind of wealth that didn't just buy things but bought the silence of the people who provided them. "Most cages are designed to keep things in, Leopold," Gaunt replied, his voice a low melodic baritone. "This one seems designed to keep the rest of the world out. There is a distinction." "A distinction without a difference when the storm rolls in," interjected Dr. Isolde Penhaligon. She stepped past them, her movements brisk and devoid of the lethargy that afflicted the others. Her hair was a shock of white, tied back so tightly it seemed to pull the skin of her temples. As the head of the research wing, she viewed the hotel guests as a necessary evil, a source of funding that occupied the lower floors while she searched for the secrets of the cosmos in the floors above. The group moved into the main hall, a vast expanse of black marble that reflected the violet hues of the encroaching dusk. The interior was a masterpiece of thermal engineering and aesthetic indulgence. Giant copper fireplaces, shaped like inverted bells, hung from the ceiling, their bellies glowing with the rhythmic pulse of burning cedar. The scent was intoxicating, a mixture of wood smoke, ozone, and the faint metallic tang of the oxygen-rich air pumped through the vents. Dinner was served in the Stargazer's refectory, a room with a floor made entirely of reinforced glass, suspended over a 3,000-foot drop into the void. To dine there was to flirt with vertigo. Blythe Pomeroy, the disenchanted heiress whose family had funded the observatory's latest telescope, stared down at the abyss beneath her feet with a look of profound boredom. She was draped in heavy emerald silk that whispered against the marble as she moved. Her companion, Oswald Fennell, sat beside her, his presence so unassuming it was almost an art form. Fennell was Thistlewood's private secretary, a man of gray tones and silent footsteps. He moved with the practiced invisibility of a shadow, his hands, long, pale, and remarkably steady, constantly occupied with a small notebook or the adjustment of his master's spectacles. "I find the height exhilarating," Blythe said, her voice dripping with a cynicism that felt practiced. "It's the only place where the air matches the temperature of my soul. Don't you agree, Cormac?" Cormac Sallow, the mountain guide and local liaison, did not look up from his plate. He was a man of the earth, out of place among the glass and chrome. His skin was the color of cured leather, and his hands were scarred by decades of grappling with the Alps. "The mountain doesn't care about your soul, Miss Pomeroy," he said gruffly. "It only cares about gravity. Up here, we are guests on sufferance. If the wind decides we've stayed too long, it will blow us off like dust." Thistlewood laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Nonsense, Sallow. We've conquered the peak. This building is a testament to the fact that there is no environment man cannot domesticate. I've spent 40 years building empires. I shan't be intimidated by a bit of frozen rock." The conversation drifted into the territories of business and science. but the subtext was thick with old resentments. Gaunt watched them all. He noticed the way Dr. Penhaligon flinched whenever Thistlewood mentioned the commercial potential of her star charts. He saw the fleeting look of pure, unadulterated hatred that Oswald Fennell directed at the back of Thistlewood's head when the older man dismissed him with a curt wave for more wine. He observed Blythe Pomeroy's trembling hands, hidden beneath the table, clutching a silk handkerchief as if it were a lifeline. As the third course, a delicate venison seasoned with mountain herbs, was being cleared, the first sign of the storm arrived. It wasn't a sound at first, but a pressure. The great glass panes of the observatory hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the crystal stemware on the table. Then came the wind. It didn't just blow, it shrieked. It was the sound of 1,000 banshees mourning the loss of the sun. The lights flickered. For a heartbeat, the room was plunged into a terrifying darkness, illuminated only by the dying embers in the copper fireplaces. When the power stabilized, the view outside had vanished. The stars, which had been so vivid and piercing only moments ago, were gone, replaced by a swirling, chaotic wall of white. "The white veil," Sallow whispered, his face pale in the artificial light. "It's come early." "The teleferico," Dr. Penhaligon said, her voice sharp with sudden anxiety. "Is it still operational?" Fennell rose and disappeared toward the communication hub near the entrance. He returned minutes later, his face a mask of professional neutrality. "The cable car has been deactivated, Doctor. The wind speeds have exceeded safety margins. The mechanical gears at the base station have been frozen by a flash ice event. We are, for all intents and purposes, isolated until the storm abates." "Isolated," Blythe repeated, a strange, hysterical edge to her voice. "How poetic. Trapped in a jewel box at the top of the world." Thistlewood stood up, his face reddening with irritation. "Ridiculous. I have a meeting in Geneva tomorrow morning. Fennell, find a way to contact the valley. I won't be held hostage by the weather." "The radio is experiencing significant atmospheric interference, sir," Fennell replied softly. "The storm is charged with static. We are quite alone." The mood turned somber. The luxury of the observatory suddenly felt fragile. A thin skin of human vanity stretched over the skeletal remains of the mountain. One by one, the guests retired to their suites, driven by the oppressive sound of the wind. Gaunt, however, did not sleep. He stood in the library, a circular room lined with leather-bound volumes and brass orreries. He watched the snow lash against the glass. There was a rhythm to the storm, a violent pulse that seemed to mirror the tension he had felt at the dinner table. He felt a presence behind him and turned to see Oswald Fennell standing in the doorway. "Mr. Gaunt," Fennell said, bowing slightly, "Mr. Thistlewood has requested a bottle of the 1945 Armagnac from the cellar. He is in the glass crow's nest, the upper observation deck. He says the storm helps him think." "In this weather," Gaunt remarked, "the crow's nest is the most exposed part of the building." "Mr. Thistlewood has never been a man of caution," Fennell replied, his eyes hooded. "He finds comfort in his own perceived invincibility." Fennell moved away, his footsteps silent on the marble. Gaunt remained in the library for another hour, lost in a treatise on celestial navigation. But a nagging sensation, a prickle at the base of his neck, refused to subside. It was the instinct that had made him one of the most sought-after investigators of human frailty. He decided to seek out Thistlewood, perhaps to offer a word of warning about the psychological effects of high-altitude isolation. He ascended the spiral staircase to the glass crow's nest. This was the pinnacle of the observatory, a small circular room projecting out from the main structure, surrounded on all sides, including the floor and ceiling, by triple reinforced glass. It was designed to give the occupant the sensation of floating among the stars. When Gaunt reached the heavy pressurized door, he found it slightly ajar. A draft of freezing air, sharp as a razor, sliced through the gap. He pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the ghostly flickering light of the storm outside. Swirls of snow, illuminated by the building's external floodlights, danced like dervishes beyond the glass. Leopold Thistlewood was there. He was sitting in the center of the room in a high-backed leather chair, facing the abyss. A bottle of Armagnac stood on the small side table, the amber liquid undisturbed. "Leopold?" Gaunt called out. There was no answer. The wind howled, a mocking response. Gaunt stepped forward, his boots clicking on the glass floor. As he rounded the chair, he saw the silver hawk's head of Thistlewood's cane lying on the floor. And then he saw Leopold. The man's eyes were wide open, reflecting the chaotic white of the storm. His face was a mask of surprised agony, his features frozen in a final, silent protest. Protruding from the center of his chest, exactly where the heart lay beneath the fine wool of his waistcoat, was an object that seemed utterly incongruous in this temple of science. It was an antique ice pick, its handle made of carved bone, driven with such force that it had pinned the titan of industry to the leather of his chair. Gaunt reached out, his gloved fingers touching Thistlewood's neck. The skin was already losing its heat to the predatory chill of the room. There was no pulse. He looked around the room. The glass crow's nest was a transparent tomb. There were no places to hide, no curtains to duck behind. The door he had entered was the only entrance. The glass walls were seamless, designed to withstand the pressure of a hurricane. He looked down at the floor. On the pristine black marble leading from the door to the chair, there were no footprints. The dusting of frost that had entered through the ajar door remained undisturbed, a white carpet of silence. Cyprian Gaunt stood in the center of the carnage, the wind screaming in his ears, and realized that the zenith of silence had been shattered. They were trapped at 3,000 meters with a killer who moved like a ghost, and the storm had only just begun. He looked at his watch. It was 11:14 p.m. The cable car couldn't return for at least 48 hours. The investigation, he knew, would not be about fingerprints or ballistics. It would be an anatomy of the soul. He turned back toward the door, his mind already cataloging the guests. The doctor with her cold equations, the heiress with her hollow eyes, the guide who feared the mountain, and the secretary who served a master he loathed. One of them had mastered the impossible. One of them had brought the violence of the valley to the purity of the peak. Gaunt closed the door to the crow's nest, locking it with the master key he took from Thistlewood's cold belt. He began the descent back to the main hall, his shadow stretching long and distorted against the copper-clad walls. The game was afoot, but the board was made of glass, and any false move would send them all screaming into the dark. As he reached the landing, he saw Dr. Penhaligon standing by the fireplace, her face illuminated by the orange glow of the embers. She looked up, her eyes searching his. "Is he coming down?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "The wind. It sounds different now, like it's caught something in its teeth." Gaunt looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Thistlewood will not be joining us for breakfast, Doctor, nor for anything else. I suggest you wake the others. We have a matter of gravity to discuss." The storm outside intensified, a roar of white noise that erased the world. Inside the Glass Observatory, the air grew heavy with the one thing more suffocating than the lack of oxygen, the presence of a murderer. Gaunt walked to the center of the hall, the black marble reflecting his solitary figure. He was no longer a guest. He was the architect of the truth, and he would not rest until every shard of glass in this house of mirrors had been accounted for. The silence that followed Gaunt's announcement was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, pressurized stillness that precedes a structural collapse. For a few seconds, the only sound was the rhythmic clicking of the cooling copper vents and the distant, manic howling of the wind against the triple-glazed pylons. Dr. Isolde Penhaligon was the first to break. She did not scream. She simply sat down, her knees appearing to give way as if the gravity of the mountain had suddenly doubled. Her hands, usually so steady when adjusting the delicate lenses of her telescopes, fluttered like trapped birds against the velvet of her skirt. "Murder," she whispered, the words sounding alien in the sterile, high-tech environment. "Here, in this temple of reason? It's a statistical impossibility. We are the only souls for miles, suspended in the air." "Precisely, Doctor," Gaunt said, his voice as cold and sharp as the ice outside. "The statistical impossibility is what makes it a certainty. There are no ghosts in the Glass Observatory. Only us." So, by the time the rest of the party had been summoned to the central lounge, a circular room dominated by a massive, suspended fireplace, the atmosphere had curdled. Blythe Pomeroy arrived wrapped in a cocoon of white mink, her eyes wide and glassy. Whether from shock or the discreet consumption of barbiturates, Gaunt could not yet tell. Oswald Fennell followed her, his face a masterpiece of blankness. He had already resumed his role as the perfect functionary, though the slight tremor in his fingers as he adjusted his spectacles betrayed a hairline fracture in his composure. Cormac Sallow brought up the rear, his heavy boots thumping with a funereal weight on the marble. He looked not at the people, but at the windows, as if expecting the mountain itself to reach in and claim them. "I must insist on a formal examination of the scene," Gaunt stated, looking at Dr. Penhaligon. "As a woman of science, your assistance would be invaluable, though I recognize the personal toll it may take. And Sallow, I need you to stand guard at the door. No one enters, no one leaves. We are preserving a moment in time." The ascent back to the glass crow's nest felt longer this time. The air seemed thinner, the oxygen scrubbers struggling against the sheer ferocity of the storm that lashed the exterior. When they reached the pressurized seal of the upper deck, Gaunt paused. He pointed to the floor. A thin, delicate layer of frost had settled near the threshold, a silver dust carried in by the draft when the door had been left ajar. "Look closely," Gaunt commanded. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dimness, illuminating the crystalline powder. "The frost is undisturbed. My own prints from my previous entry are near the door, but notice the path leading to Mr. Thistlewood's chair. It is a tabula rasa, a blank slate. And yet, the killer reached him. The killer drove an ice pick into his heart and retreated." Dr. Penhaligon leaned in, her professional curiosity momentarily overriding her horror. "The frost began forming when the pressure seal was compromised. If the killer left before the frost settled, there would be no marks. But the seal was broken by the door being left open. It's a paradox." They entered the room. The body of Leopold Thistlewood remained as Gaunt had found it, a fallen king on a leather throne. Gaunt began the forensic autopsy with the meticulousness of a jeweler. He did not touch the body yet. He circled it, observing the geometry of death. The ice pick was the centerpiece of the carnage. It was an antique tool, the kind used by 19th-century alpinists. The handle was carved from the yellowed femur of a large animal, perhaps a goat or a deer, etched with faint, scrolling patterns that had been smoothed by a century of palms. The steel spike was long, slender, and triangular in cross-section, designed to split frozen water with minimal effort. It had been driven into the fourth intercostal space with terrifying precision. "A single, powerful thrust," Gaunt noted, his voice echoing in the glass chamber. "The angle is slightly upward. This suggests the killer was either shorter than Thistlewood or was striking from a slightly lower position, perhaps kneeling. But Leopold was seated. If the killer knelt, they would have been at eye level with his chest." He leaned closer, his nose inches from the wound. "There is very little blood. The cold has already begun to constrict the capillaries, and the weapon itself acted as a bung, sealing the wound it created. But look at the grip. The hand that held this did not hesitate. There is no hesitation mark, no secondary tearing. It was the work of someone who understands the fragility of the human frame." "Doctor," Penhaligon knelt beside him, her breath hitching. "This pick, I recognize it. It's from the historical display in the North Corridor. It was part of the Founders of the Peak exhibit. It was supposed to be behind reinforced glass. Evidently, the glass was not reinforced against a determined mind," Gaunt said. He turned his attention to the small table beside the chair. The bottle of Armagnac sat there, its cork removed, but the liquid inside untouched. Next to it lay Thistlewood's pocket watch, its gold casing reflecting the flickering light of the storm. Gaunt picked it up with a silk handkerchief. "The watch has stopped," he observed. 11:08 p.m. The glass face is cracked. In the struggle, perhaps? There was no struggle, Penhaligon countered, pointing to the victim's hands. They rested loosely on the arms of the chair. Look at his fingernails. No skin, no fibers. He didn't even raise his hands to defend himself. He sat there and watched it happen. Gaunt nodded, his mind spinning a web of possibilities. Or he knew his visitor so well that the thought of violence never crossed his mind until the steel was already in his ribs. A friend, a servant, a colleague. He stood up and walked to the perimeter of the room. The glass crow's nest was a circle, roughly 15 feet in diameter. He examined the seams where the glass panels met the floor. The wind was so violent now that the entire room felt as though it were breathing, the glass flexing mere millimeters under the atmospheric weight. The impossible element, Gaunt mused. The frost on the floor shows no tracks. The door was the only way in. The windows do not open. Yet, Leopold Thistlewood is dead. If we assume the killer did not fly, we must assume they used the floor. And if they used the floor without leaving a trace, they either levitated or they manipulated the very environment of this room. He turned back to the doctor. Tell me about the ventilation in this wing. Is it possible to reverse the airflow? To blow the frost away after one has exited? The system is centralized, she replied, her voice regaining some of its academic steel. But the crow's nest has its own climate override to prevent fogging on the glass. One could theoretically crank the heaters to maximum to melt any ice or frost, then drop the temperature back to freezing once the moisture had evaporated. But that would take time, 20, 30 minutes, and the smell of damp marble would linger. Gaunt sniffed the air. It smelled of nothing but ozone and the faint leathery scent of the chair. No dampness. The mystery of the tracks remains. Let us return to the living. The dead have told us how they died, now the living must tell us why. And they descended to the lounge, where the suspects were arranged like chess pieces. Gaunt took a seat in a high-backed chair, positioned so that the copper fireplace was behind him, casting his face into a formidable shadow. I shall speak with each of you, Gaunt announced. Individually, the rest of you will remain here in this room, under the observation of Mr. Sallow. In a house of glass, there are no secrets, only reflections. I intend to find the one that does not fit. He beckoned to Oswald Fennel first. The secretary rose with a stiff military grace and followed Gaunt into the adjacent map room. The walls were covered in antique celestial charts, their parchment yellowed and brittle, contrasting with the sleek chrome of the table between them. Mr. Fennel, Gaunt began, you served Leopold Thistlewood for 12 years, a long time for a man of his abrasive temperament. Fennel sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap. Mr. Thistlewood was a demanding employer, yes, but he was consistent. In my profession, consistency is more valuable than kindness. And yet, Gaunt leaned forward. At dinner, I saw a look in your eyes, a look that suggested you had finally reached the end of your endurance. What did he do to you, Oswald? Or rather, what was he about to do? Fennel's eyes flickered, a brief microscopic twitch. He was planning to retire. He intended to liquidate the Thistlewood holdings and move his assets into a private trust, a trust that did not include a pension for his personal staff. 12 years of 18-hour days, Mr. Gaunt and I was to be discarded like a used blotter. A powerful motive for resentment, Gaunt noted. Where were you at 11 p.m.? In the pantry preparing the Armagnac service, Fennel replied smoothly. I took it up to the landing just outside the crow's nest. Mr. Thistlewood shouted through the door that he wasn't to be disturbed for another hour. He sounded agitated. I left the bottle on the service trolley and returned to my quarters to finish some correspondence. Did you see anyone else in the corridor? Only Dr. Penhaligon. She was heading toward the observatory deck on the level below. We did not speak. Gaunt dismissed him and called for Blythe Pomeroy. She entered the room with a trail of expensive perfume, sandalwood and jasmine, that felt stifling in the thin air. She did not sit. She paced the length of the map room, her silk dress hissing against the floor. "He was a monster, you know," she said, before Gaunt could ask a single question. "My uncle didn't just manage wealth. He consumed people. He bought my father's debts, and in doing so, he bought me. I've been his social ornament for a decade. Do you know what it's like to have your entire existence curated by a man who views you as a tax write-off?" "I can imagine it is a heavy burden, Miss Pomeroy," Gaunt said softly. "Is that why you were seen arguing with him near the Teleferico station earlier today?" Blythe stopped pacing. Her face went pale. "Who told you that? It wasn't an argument. It was a plea. I wanted to leave. I wanted to go to Paris, to start over. He told me that if I left, he would ensure I was destitute. He called me unprofitable stock. And at 11 p.m., I was in my room, crying, and perhaps drinking. I have the bottles to prove the latter, though I doubt the tears left a record. Did you leave your room at any point?" "No. Why would I? To see more snow? To hear him bark more orders? No, Mr. Gaunt. I stayed in my cage." As she left, Gaunt noted the way she avoided looking at the map of the mountain. There was a frantic energy in her, a desperation that could easily turn to violence. Next was Cormac Sallow. The guide sat heavily, his presence filling the room with the scent of wet wool and tobacco. He looked uncomfortable in the presence of the maps. To him, the mountain was a living thing, not a series of lines on paper. "You don't like this place, do you, Cormac?" Gaunt asked. "It's a scar," Sallow grunted. "Man shouldn't be up here this time of year. The Aiguille du Midi is for the eagles and the wind. Thistlewood thought his money could buy the peak. The mountain has a way of balancing the books, Mr. Gaunt." "Did you help the mountain balance the books tonight?" Sallow looked him dead in the eye. His pupils were narrowed, his gaze steady. "I'm a guide. My job is to keep people alive on this rock. If I wanted him dead, I'd have cut his line on the ascent. I wouldn't use a museum piece in a glass room. It's too fussy, too much like a play." "Where were you during the storm's peak?" "Checking the seals on the lower levels. The pressure was dropping. If a pane blows, we all freeze in minutes. I was in the machine room until midnight. You can ask the engineers if they ever wake up from the sedative the thin air provides." Finally, Dr. Penhaligon returned. She seemed more composed now, her scientific mind having processed the initial shock. "The ice pick," she said before Gaunt could speak. "I've been thinking about it. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol. That specific pick belonged to Jean-Marc Devy, the man who first mapped this peak. Thistlewood obsessed over it. He bought it at an auction 3 years ago and insisted it be displayed here. To kill him with it, it's a form of poetic justice." "Or a very deliberate framing," Gaunt added. "Doctor, you mentioned you were in the observatory level at 11 p.m. Did you see or hear anything unusual?" She hesitated. "I heard a sound. Not the wind, a mechanical sound, like the cycling of the airlock, but different, a high-pitched whine. I assumed it was the storm playing tricks on the external sensors. I didn't investigate." Gaunt leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He visualized the Glass Observatory, the copper, the glass, the thin air, and the swirling frost. The pieces were all there, but they were distorted, like light passing through a prism. "One final question, Doctor. The star charts Thistlewood was looking at. He was an amateur astronomer, wasn't he?" "He was a pretender," she spat. "He liked the prestige of it. But he was looking for something specific. He was obsessed with the great silence, the gaps in the stellar map where no light reaches. He called it his private void." "And did he find it?" "Tonight," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I think he finally did." Gaunt stood up and walked to the window. The storm showed no signs of relenting. The Glass Observatory was a speck of light in an infinite ocean of white chaos. He knew now that the murder was not a crime of passion, but a crime of calculation, a geometry of death that required a specific knowledge of the building's soul. The killer was among them, breathing the same recycled oxygen, warming their hands by the same copper fires. And the most terrifying part, Gaunt realized, was that the crime was still in progress. The death of Leopold Thistlewood was merely the opening move in a much larger, much darker game. "Go back to the lounge," Gaunt told her. "Tell the others to try and sleep. I will be staying in the library. I have a feeling the stars have more to tell me than the survivors." As he watched her leave, Gaunt's gaze fell on the map of the Aiguille du Midi. He noticed a small handwritten note in the margin of the chart, barely visible in the dim light. It was in Thistlewood's cramped, arrogant hand. "The glass reflects only what we want to see. The truth is, in the shadow it casts." Gaunt checked his watch. 2:14 a.m. The long night of the soul had only just begun, and the zenith of silence was about to become a crescendo of revelations. The library of the Glass Observatory was a sanctuary of silence, but tonight it felt like the interior of a skull, crowded with memories and the echoes of things left unsaid. Cyprian Gaunt sat in a high-backed chair of oxblood leather, surrounded by volumes that spoke of the stars, the earth, and the various ways man had attempted to conquer both. The room was circular, a microcosm of the observatory itself, and the scent of aged parchment, linseed oil, and the sharp metallic tang of the oxygen vents created a heady atmosphere. Gaunt held a leather-bound ledger he had retrieved from Leopold Thistlewood's private desk. It was an artifact of greed, its pages filled with the cramped, predatory handwriting of a man who viewed the world as a series of hostile takeovers. As Gaunt turned the pages, he realized that the people gathered in this crystalline tomb were not merely guests. They were the casualties of Thistlewood's ascent. The heavy door creaked open, admitting a draft of cold air and the ghost-like figure of Blythe Pomeroy. She had traded her emerald silk for a dressing gown of heavy charcoal wool, yet she still looked fragile, as if the altitude were slowly turning her to glass. "You won't find his soul in those books, Mr. Gaunt," she said, her voice a weary rasp. Leopold didn't have a soul. He had a balance sheet. Gaunt looked up, the light from a copper desk lamp carving deep shadows into the hollows of his cheeks. "A balance sheet can be more revealing than a diary, Miss Pomeroy. It tells us what a man valued. For instance, I see your father's name here, a series of loans dating back to the late 90s, the Pomeroy Shard mining concern." Blythe walked to the center of the room, her gaze fixed on a brass orrery that depicted the solar system. She reached out and touched the gold-plated sphere of Saturn, her finger trembling. "My father was a dreamer, Mr. Gaunt. He believed there was a vein of rare earth minerals in the Peruvian Andes that would change the world. He lacked the capital to reach it, so he turned to the one man who had plenty. Leopold didn't just lend him money. He orchestrated a slow, meticulous strangulation. He waited until the infrastructure was built, until the tunnels were deep, and then he called in the debt. My father took his own life in a hotel room in Lima. Leopold took the mine. He renamed it Thistlewood Prime." "And you?" Gaunt asked softly. "Why stay with the man who broke your family?" Blythe turned, her eyes flashing with a sudden bitter fire. "Because he made sure I had nowhere else to go. He settled a small trust on me, just enough to keep me in silk and gin, provided I played the part of the grateful niece. I was his trophy, a living reminder of his triumph over the Pomeroys. Every time he looked at me, he was savoring his victory over my father. Do you know what that does to a person's mind, Mr. Gaunt? To be a piece of furniture in your own ruin?" "It creates a powerful impetus for erasure," Gaunt remarked, "to remove the architect of your misery." "If I had killed him," Blythe said, leaning over the desk until her face was inches from his, "I would have done it in the light. I would have wanted him to see me as the last thing he ever saw. I wouldn't have used a dusty old ice pick in a dark room. Sir—" She left as abruptly as she had arrived, leaving behind a lingering scent of sandalwood and despair. Gaunt watched her go, then returned to the ledger. There was another name, one that appeared not in the debts, but in the patents. Penhaligon. He rose and made his way through the winding corridors to the stellar observation deck, located one level below the scene of the crime. Here, The floor was not glass, but a dark, textured composite that absorbed sound. Dr. Isolde Penhaligon was there, standing before a terminal that displayed a shifting map of the Andromeda Galaxy. The blue light of the screen gave her skin a spectral, translucent quality. "The Great Silence," Gaunt said, stepping into the luminescence. "That is what you were discussing at dinner." Isolde did not turn. "It is a region of space where there is an absence of radio signatures, an absence of light, an absence of everything. It is a cosmic void." Leopold was fascinated by it. He thought that if he could claim the discovery, his name would live as long as the stars. "But it wasn't his discovery, was it, Doctor?" Isolde's shoulders stiffened. She finally turned, her face a mask of controlled academic fury. "I spent 15 years in the Atacama Desert, Mr. Gaunt. I mapped those coordinates when Leopold Thistlewood couldn't tell a telescope from a toaster. I brought the data to him because I needed the funding for the Glass Observatory. I thought he was a patron. I didn't realize he was a parasite." "He patented your findings under the Thistlewood Institute," Gaunt noted. "I saw the filings in his ledger. Your name is relegated to a footnote in the acknowledgments section." "He stole my immortality," Isolde said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than a shout. "In the scientific community, if your name is not on the primary paper, you do not exist. He erased 15 years of my life with a signature and a legal team. He told me that without his money, my data was just expensive noise. He was going to announce the full findings tomorrow in Geneva, under his name alone." "A motive of intellectual survival," Gaunt mused. "But tell me, Doctor, as a woman of logic, how does one enter a locked room, kill a man, and leave no footprints on a layer of frost?" Isolde looked at the ceiling, toward the room where the corpse lay. "I have been processing that, Mr. Gaunt. If the floor was truly undisturbed, then the killer did not walk. But the laws of physics are not suggestions. Perhaps the frost itself is the key. Frost forms when moisture in the air meets a surface below the dew point. If the room was vacuum sealed and then opened, the frost would form instantly. If the killer was already inside when the door was opened and left as the frost was forming, then the tracks would be covered by the settling crystals," Gaunt finished. "But that would mean the killer was hiding in the crow's nest for hours, waiting for Thistlewood. In a room made entirely of glass. It is a transparent box, Doctor. There is no furniture save for the chair, no curtains, no shadows." Isolde shook her head. "Then we are left with the impossible. And I do not believe in the impossible. I only believe in variables we have yet to account for." Gaunt left her to her stars and sought out the one man who knew the mountain better than the humans who built upon it. He found Cormac Sallow in the maintenance sub-level, a place of vibrating pipes and the heavy thrum of the oxygen generators. Sallow was sharpening a small knife, the rhythmic shh of steel on stone, a counterpoint to the howling wind. "The Frozen Vein Expedition, Cormac," Gaunt began, leaning against a copper pylon. 1994, the Karakoram Range. 3 guides died. 2 climbers were lost. The official report said it was an act of God. Sallow stopped sharpening. He looked at the blade, then at Gaunt. His eyes were like flint. God had nothing to do with it. It was the equipment. The ropes were substandard. The oxygen tanks were refurbished surplus. Thistlewood was the primary contractor. He cut the budget by 40% to pad his margins. I was the lead guide. I told him the gear wouldn't hold in a storm. He told me to stop being a peasant and do my job. Sallow stood up, his massive frame dwarfing the narrow corridor. I watched my brother fall 500 feet because a carabiner snapped like a twig, a Thistlewood carabiner. When the lawsuit came, Leopold bought the judges. He turned the blame on me, said I was negligent. I haven't been allowed to lead a major expedition since. I'm a glorified janitor for rich tourists now, thanks to him. And tonight, Gaunt said, the mountain brought him to you. In a storm just like the one in '94. I didn't kill him, Sallow said, though there was no conviction in his voice. If I had, I'd have used my bare hands. I'd have wanted to feel the life leave him. That ice pick, that's a gentleman's way to die. It's clean. It's surgical. I'm a blunt instrument, Mr. Gaunt. Gaunt nodded. A blunt instrument can still be used for a sharp purpose, Cormac. Where is the museum key? Ask the secretary, Sallow spat. Fennel keeps the keys. He's the one who organizes the heritage tours for the donors. He's got a key for every lock in this ice palace. Gaunt's mind turned to Oswald Fennel, the man of shadows, the man who had served a tyrant for 12 years without a word of protest. Gaunt returned to the main lounge, where Fennel was meticulously tidying the tea service, despite the fact that no one was drinking. A creature of habit, Mr. Fennel, Gaunt observed, even in the wake of a murder. Habit is the only thing that keeps the mind from fracturing in conditions like these, sir, Fennel replied, not looking up. Order is our only defense against the chaos outside. Or a way to mask it, Gaunt suggested. I've been learning about the others. Their debts, their stolen lives, their lost brothers. But you, Oswald, you are a cipher. 12 years is a long time to watch a man like Thistlewood. What did you see that finally broke the dam? Fennel paused, a silver spoon mid-air. He turned his head slightly, and for the first time, the mask of the perfect servant slipped. His eyes were not dull. They were burning with a cold, intellectual contempt. I saw everything, Mr. Gaunt. I saw the bribes to the Geneva officials. I saw the hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands that funded his charitable foundation. I saw the way he laughed when he read the suicide note of Blythe's father. He called it a delightful piece of prose. I didn't just serve him. I was the repository of his sins. I was the man who filed the evidence of his atrocities. And you realized he was going to discard you, Gaunt said. The trust, the pension. He told me last week, Fennel said, his voice as flat as the marble floor. He said, Oswald, you've been a loyal dog, but a dog doesn't need a retirement plan. It needs a quiet place to lie down. He was going to fire me the moment we returned to the valley. No severance, no reference. I would have been a 50-year-old man with a history of serving a monster, and not a penny to show for it. So you took the ice pick, Gaunt hypothesized. I have the keys, yes, Fennel admitted. But I was in the pantry. I have no way of explaining the lack of footprints. If I were to kill him, I would have used a method that was not so theatrical. I am a man of ledgers, not legends. Gaunt walked to the center of the lounge and looked up at the ceiling. Above him, through the layers of glass and steel, lay the crow's nest. He began to pace, his mind reconstructing the scene. The frost, the locked door, the antique pick, the cracked watch. Suddenly, he stopped. He looked at the copper fireplace, then at the oxygen vents. He remembered the high-pitched whine Dr. Penhaligon had mentioned. The air, Gaunt whispered to himself. It isn't about the floor. It's about the air. He turned back to the group, his eyes sharp with a new realization. The history of this place is built on theft. Thistlewood stole a mine, a discovery, a reputation, and a life. But the killer has stolen the very laws of physics. We have been looking at the shards of the past to find a motive, and we have found plenty. Every person in this room had a reason to see Leopold Thistlewood dead. But only one of you understood the secret of the Glass Observatory. And what is that? Blythe asked, her voice trembling. The observatory was not built for people, Gaunt said, his voice rising above the roar of the wind. It was built for instruments, and instruments do not need to walk. He looked at his watch. 4:30 a.m. The first light of dawn would not arrive for hours, but in Gaunt's mind, the sun was already beginning to rise on the truth. He needed to check one more thing, a detail so small he had overlooked it in the shadow of the murder. He headed toward the Teleferico control room. He needed to see the mechanical logs. If his theory was correct, the storm wasn't the only thing that had isolated them. The zenith of silence was a masterpiece of engineering, and it was the engineering that would ultimately betray the murderer. As he walked, he felt a presence in the corridor behind him. He did not turn. He knew that the killer was now watching him. Realizing that the investigator was no longer wandering in the dark, the shards of the past had been assembled, and the resulting image was as sharp and lethal as the ice pick itself. "The mountain has a way of balancing the books," Sallow had said. Gaunt was about to find out exactly how much interest had accrued on Leopold Thistlewood's debts. As the clock in the library chimed 5 times, a cold, mechanical sound that seemed to be muffled by the thickening atmosphere, the very air within the Glass Observatory began to betray its inhabitants. It started as a subtle shift, a change in the pressure that made the inner ear pop and the mind wander into territories of unreason. The oxygen scrubbers, those silent deities of the peak that transmuted the thin Alpine ether into breathable life, were no longer humming in their usual rhythmic baritone. Instead, they had developed a high-pitched, discordant whine, the sound of thin air that Dr. Penhaligon had mentioned with such trepidation. Cyprian Gaunt felt it first in his temples. It was a rhythmic throbbing, like the beat of a distant drum submerged in dark water. He rose from the oxblood chair, his movements uncharacteristically sluggish. The library, with its thousands of leather-bound secrets, felt as though it were expanding and contracting, the walls breathing in a slow, suffocating cadence. He walked to the window. The white veil was no longer a storm. It was a solid entity, a wall of chaotic marble that had erased the distinction between the earth and the heavens. He made his way to the central lounge, where the copper fireplace was now a dying ember, its warmth unable to penetrate the encroaching chill. The suspects were huddled there, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange light. They looked like ghosts in a copper cage. Blythe Pomeroy was draped in her charcoal wool, her eyes unfocused, her hands clutching a silver flask with a white-knuckled intensity. Oswald Fennel was slumped in a chair, his usual upright posture dissolved into a posture of defeat. Even the formidable Dr. Penhaligon looked weathered, her skin appearing more translucent than ever, revealing the delicate blue tracery of her veins. "The oxygen!" Penhaligon gasped, her voice a thin thread of sound. "The levels, they're dropping. The sensors in the lab are reporting a 20% decrease in O2 saturation within the last hour. Someone has throttled the intake." "It's the mountain," Cormac Sallow growled. He was the only one who seemed relatively unaffected, his lungs accustomed to the brutal scarcity of the heights. "I told you, it's reclaiming the peak. The machinery was never meant to hold against a storm of this magnitude." "Machinery does not fail in a vacuum of intent, Cormac," Gaunt said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "Machines are sabotaged. Fennel, the keys to the maintenance sublevel. Now." Fennel fumbled with his waistcoat, his fingers trembling as he produced a heavy brass ring. Gaunt took them and beckoned to Sallow. "You know the layout of the vents. Come with me. If we don't restore the flow, the murder of Leopold Thistlewood will be the least of our concerns. We will all be a footnote in a tragedy of frozen lungs." The descent to the Copper Heart, the mechanical soul of the observatory, was a journey into a subterranean nightmare. The temperature dropped with every step. The walls here were not glass, but raw granite and reinforced steel, weeping with condensation that froze into jagged teeth of ice. The sound of the whine grew louder, a piercing shriek that resonated in the bones of the skull. Sallow led the way with a heavy industrial lantern. The beam cut through the dark, revealing the labyrinth of pipes and pistons that kept the crystalline palace above from becoming a tomb. They reached the primary oxygen manifold, a massive copper drum etched with the marks of its Victorian-inspired design. "Look there," Gaunt pointed. A heavy steel valve, designed to be operated only by a mechanical wrench, had been turned. A bypass pipe had been opened, venting the precious oxygen into the granite crevices of the mountain instead of the rooms above. But it wasn't just the valve. A handful of fine, crystalline sand, the kind used in the laboratory's hourglasses, had been poured into the intake filters, slowly grinding the turbines to a halt. "This wasn't a failure," Sallow whispered, examining the damage. This was a surgical strike. Whoever did this knew exactly which valve would drain us without triggering the emergency alarms immediately. It is a slow execution, Gaunt noted, leaning against a cold pipe as a wave of dizziness washed over him. The killer isn't just hiding, they are simplifying the board. If we are all too weak to move, we are too weak to accuse. Help me with the wrench, Cormac. We must close the bypass. The two men struggled against the frozen steel. The physical exertion in the oxygen-depleted air was excruciating. Gaunt felt his heart racing, a frantic bird trapped in his chest, his vision blurred, the edges of the lantern's light turning into fractals of violet and gold. With a final guttural heave from Sallow, the valve groaned and turned. The high-pitched whine began to descend in pitch, returning to the steady, comforting thrum of life. "It will take an hour for the levels to stabilize," Gaunt panted, his forehead resting against the cold copper. "But the damage to the filters, that is a temporary fix at best. We are on borrowed time." They ascended back to the lounge, but as they reached the final landing, a scream tore through the silence of the corridor. It was a high, thin sound, the sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Gaunt forced his leaden legs to run. He burst into the lounge to find a scene of domestic horror. Blythe Pomeroy was on the floor, her body convulsing in a rhythmic, violent seizure. Her silver flask had fallen, its contents spilling across the black marble, a dark, pungent liquid that smelled of bitter almonds and something metallic. Oswald Fennell was standing over her, his hands raised in a gesture of helpless panic. Dr. Penhaligon was already kneeling by the girl's side, trying to clear her airway. "She drank," Penhaligon shouted over the sound of the wind. "She took a draught from her flask and collapsed." "It's not the air, Gaunt. She's been poisoned." Gaunt knelt beside the flask, careful not to touch the liquid. He sniffed the air around the spill. "Cyanide? No. Something more complex. Digitalis? It's a cardiac arrest in progress." "I have the medical kit in the lab," Penhaligon cried. "I need atropine. Fennel, help me get her to the infirmary." The next 20 minutes were a blurred montage of desperation. They carried Blythe to the small, sterile infirmary wing. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, the heiress looked like a broken doll. Penhaligon worked with a cold, desperate efficiency, administering the antidote and monitoring the faltering pulse. Gaunt stood by the door, his eyes scanning the room, observing the reactions of the others. Fennel was ashen, his gaze fixed on the floor. Sallow stood like a monolith in the corner, his face unreadable. The air was still thin, making every breath a conscious effort, every thought a struggle through molasses. "She's stabilizing," Penhaligon finally said, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. "The dose was enough to kill a person of her weight, but she must have diluted it with the gin in her flask. The alcohol slowed the absorption. She's lucky, or perhaps she wasn't the intended target." "What do you mean, Doctor?" Fennel asked, his voice cracking. "The flask," Gaunt said, stepping into the center of the room. "Blythe has been clutching that flask since dinner, but I noticed something earlier. At dinner, Leopold Thistlewood reached for that same flask, thinking it was his own water vessel. They are both silver, both bearing the same Thistlewood crest. In the dim light of the storm, a mistake would be easy." "You think the poison was meant for Leopold?" Sallow asked. "I think the killer is a master of redundancies," Gaunt replied. "If the ice pick failed, the poison would have succeeded. Or perhaps the poison was meant to be the final move, and the ice pick was a sudden, violent improvisation. But look at the timing. The oxygen sabotage occurred while we were all distracted by the murder. And the poisoning occurred while Sallow and I were in the sub-levels." He walked over to Fennel. "Oswald, you were the one who prepared the drinks this evening. You handled the flasks. You handled the Armagnac."
"Una, I did," Fennel whispered, his eyes wide. "But I didn't. I would never. Why would I poison Miss Blythe? She was the only one who treated me with a shred of dignity." "Perhaps you weren't poisoning her," Gaunt suggested. Perhaps you were trying to remove the last person who could link you to Thistlewood's secrets, or perhaps someone else used your orderly routine against you. The atmosphere in the room was now as lethal as the air outside.
The suspicion was a physical presence, a cold draft that no copper fireplace could warm. Gaunt felt the pressure in his head increasing. The lack of oxygen was beginning to cause hallucinations, fleeting shadows in the corners of his vision, the sound of Leopold Thistlewood's dry laugh echoing in the pipes. "We are being picked off," Penhaligon said, her voice trembling. "One by one. First the patriarch, now the heir. Who is next? The scientist who knows too much? The guide who knows the paths? The secretary who knows the books?" "The answer is in the sound," Gaunt said, his mind clutching at a thread of logic. "Dr. Penhaligon, you mentioned a high-pitched whine before I found the body. Sallow and I found the same whine in the sublevels. But the whine in the sublevels was caused by the bypass valve. The whine you heard was before the sabotage. It was coming from the crow's nest." He looked at the doctor. "What mechanical systems are present in the crow's nest, besides the heat and the air?" "Nothing," she replied. "It's just glass and a chair. There are no moving parts." "And yet you heard it," Gaunt mused. "A mechanical cycling, a sound that shouldn't exist in a room of glass." He turned and walked back toward the lounge, his mind racing. The pieces were beginning to align, but the image they formed was so monstrous, so technically brilliant, that it defied the standard definitions of murder. He remembered the cracked face of Thistlewood's watch. 11:08 p.m. He remembered the undisturbed frost. "Sallow," Gaunt called out. "The external floodlights. Can they be moved?" "They're fixed," the guide replied. "Designed to illuminate the pylons. Why?" "Because in a house of glass the light is a witness," Gaunt said. "And I think the witness saw something that none of us were meant to understand." He reached the lounge and walked to the great window. The storm was momentarily thinning, an eye in the atmospheric chaos. For a brief second he could see the jagged peaks of the surrounding mountains, like the teeth of a prehistoric beast. And there, reflected in the glass, he saw the distorted image of the observatory itself. He realized then that the building was not just a hotel or a research station. It was a giant, multifaceted lens, and Leopold Thistlewood had been sitting at its focal point. "The sound of thin air," Gaunt whispered. "It wasn't the oxygen. It was the pressure." He turned back to the group, his face a mask of grim realization. "We have been looking for a killer who walked through the door, but the killer never had to enter the room. The killer used the mountain itself as a weapon, and the ice pick was merely the signature on the death warrant." Before he could explain further, the lights flickered and died. This time they did not return. The auxiliary generators, the last line of defense against the Alpine night, had been severed. The silence that followed was absolute. The zenith of silence had returned, and in the darkness, the sound of the wind was replaced by something much closer, the sound of a footstep on marble, a slow, deliberate step. "Stay where you are," Gaunt commanded, his hand reaching for the heavy brass orrery on the table. "Do not move. In the dark, we are all suspects, but only one of us has the key to the light." A match flared. In the tiny flickering circle of light, Gaunt saw the face of the killer. It was a face he had seen a dozen times that night, but now, stripped of its social mask, it was a visage of terrifying, crystalline purity. "You are very clever, Mr. Gaunt," the voice said, sounding as cold as the ice outside. "But cleverness is no substitute for altitude. Up here the truth is whatever the survivor says it is." The match went out. In the total darkness of the Aiguille du Midi, the fourth chapter of the tragedy ended, not with a revelation, but with the sound of a struggle, a desperate, gasping conflict in the thin air, where the only prize was the right to breathe for one more hour. The darkness in the Glass Observatory was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical weight, cold and suffocating, that seemed to press the very breath from Cyprian Gaunt's lungs. In the absolute void that followed the failure of the auxiliary generators, the human senses, deprived of their primary anchor, began to manufacture horrors. The howling wind outside transformed into the screams of those lost on the mountain, and the scent of the dying copper fires became the smell of a guttering civilization. Gaunt stood perfectly still, his back against the cold surface of a marble pillar. He could hear his own heartbeat, a frantic, irregular thrum, and the rasp of his own breath, which felt like sandpaper against his throat. Then he heard it, the sound that had ended the previous chapter. A footstep, not the heavy rhythmic tread of Cormac Sallow, nor the brisk, impatient click of Dr. Penhaligon's heels. This was a sliding sound, a cautious shifting of weight that suggested someone moving with the predatory grace of a ghost. "I know you are there," Gaunt said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the thin air. "And I know what you are holding. But the darkness is a double-edged blade. You cannot strike what you cannot see, and in this room, I am the shadow." A sudden, violent movement erupted to his left. A heavy object, the brass orrery Gaunt had noted earlier, smashed into the pillar inches from his head, the metal celestial spheres clattering across the marble floor like frozen raindrops. Gaunt lunged forward, not away from the sound, but toward it. His hands met heavy wool and the sharp, bony frame of an assailant. They grappled in the dark, a desperate, silent struggle where the only stakes were the right to continue breathing. Gaunt felt a cold hand claw at his face, smelling of iron and old paper, before a powerful shove sent him reeling back. A match flared again, but this time it was in Gaunt's own hand. He had spent his years in the shadows of the world, learning the value of a quick light. The flame illuminated the library for a fleeting second. The room was empty. The door was swinging shut, the brass latch clicking into place with a sound like a guillotine. He was alone, locked in the library, with the secrets of the dead. The paper labyrinth Gaunt did not attempt to follow. Instead, he moved to the central desk and lit a heavy tallow candle he had purloined from the kitchens earlier. The light was weak, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the spines of the books. But it was enough. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out the star charts he had taken from Leopold Thistlewood's private desk. At first glance, they were exactly what Dr. Penhaligon had described, meticulous maps of the Andromeda Galaxy with specific focus on the Great Silence, those terrifying voids where no light reached the earth. But as Gaunt spread them out on the mahogany surface, his surgical intellect began to see the anomalies. These were not merely astronomical records. There were annotations in the margins, written in a ink that seemed to shimmer with a metallic luster. "Not stars," Gaunt whispered, his voice echoing in the hollow room. "Coordinates." He picked up a magnifying loupe and leaned over the primary chart. Beneath the constellations of the northern hemisphere, Thistlewood had overlaid a second set of lines. They were faint, almost invisible to the naked eye, but under the lens they revealed a terrifying geometry. They were the structural blueprints of the Aiguille du Midi itself, the veins of the mountain, the pressure points of the rock, and the exact placement of the Glass Observatory's foundations. The realization hit him with the force of an Alpine slide. Thistlewood hadn't been looking for a private void in the heavens. He had been looking for one inside the mountain. "The Pomeroy shard," Gaunt murmured. The door to the library creaked open. It was not the killer returning to finish the job, but Dr. Isolde Penhaligon. She looked haggard, her white hair disheveled, her eyes rimmed with the red fatigue of the oxygen-starved. She carried a small chemical lamp that cast a harsh blue light. "I saw the light," she said, her voice a hollow rasp. "The others are in the infirmary with Blythe. Sallow is barricading the main doors. He thinks the storm is trying to get in. He doesn't realize it's already here." "Doctor, look at this," Gaunt commanded, beckoning her to the desk. "You told me Thistlewood was an amateur, a pretender. But look at these overlays. He wasn't studying the stars, he was using them as a fixed reference point to map the internal cavities of this peak." Isolde leaned over the charts, her professional mask slipping for a moment to reveal a look of profound shock. She traced the lines with a trembling finger. This is seismic triangulation. He was using the ultra-low frequency vibrations of the mountain to create a sonar map. But why? Because of what lies beneath the great silence, Gaunt said. Blythe's father died because he couldn't find the heart of the vein in the Andes. But Leopold didn't just steal the mine, he stole the methodology. He realized that the Aiguille du Midi sits on a geological anomaly, a pocket of rare earth minerals so pure they would render the current global market obsolete. This observatory isn't a hotel, Doctor. It's a massive, multi-billion-dollar surveying instrument disguised as a luxury retreat. And the murder? Isolde asked, her breath hitching. Why now? Why here? Because tomorrow in Geneva he wasn't going to announce a scientific discovery, Gaunt explained, his mind racing through the implications. He was going to announce the liquidation of Thistlewood Holdings and the formation of a new extraction conglomerate. He was going to strip the mountain, Doctor. He was going to destroy the very peak you spent your life studying. He was going to turn this temple of reason into a quarry. The motive had shifted. It was no longer about a disgruntled secretary's pension or an heiress's resentment. It was about the preservation of a legacy versus the greed of a titan. But there was more. Gaunt pointed to a specific point on the map, the glass crow's nest. Look at the pressure seals here, Gaunt noted. The crow's nest isn't just an observation deck. It's the highest point of the pneumatic system. It's the release valve for the entire building's atmosphere, the cryptogram of blood. As they spoke, the sound of the wind outside changed again. It was no longer a shriek. It was a rhythmic thumping, like a giant hand beating against the glass. The pressure in the room began to fluctuate wildly. Gaunt felt a sharp pain in his sinuses, and Isolde groaned, clutching her ears. "The air," she gasped. "The killer. They haven't just throttled the oxygen, they're cycling the pressure. They're trying to trigger a Benz event in all of us." "The sound of thin air," Gaunt said, his eyes widening. "The high-pitched whine you heard before the murder. It wasn't the oxygen scrubbers. It was the sound of a vacuum pump. The killer used the building's own climate control to create a pressure differential. They didn't have to walk to the chair, Doctor." He grabbed a pen and began a series of rapid calculations on the back of the star chart. At 11 hours p.m., the storm was at its peak. The external pressure was dropping. If the killer increased the internal pressure in the crow's nest to its absolute maximum, then suddenly opened the door, the air would rush out with the force of a small explosion, Isolde finished, her scientific mind catching the thread. Anything not bolted down would be propelled toward the exit. But the frost, how does the frost remain undisturbed? "Because the frost wasn't there yet," Gaunt said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The frost formed because of the sudden depressurization. When you drop the pressure of a gas instantly, the temperature plummets. It's the Joule-Thomson effect. The moisture in the room didn't just settle, it flash froze out of the air. The killer didn't walk through the frost. The killer created the frost as they were leaving." "But the ice pick," Isolde countered. "How does a pressure change drive an ice pick into a man's heart?" "It doesn't," Gaunt said. "The pressure change was the distraction, the mechanism that allowed the impossible entry. But the killer had to be there to guide the blade. And there is only one person in this building with the physical strength and the knowledge of the mountain's balancing of books to pull that off." Suddenly the library door was kicked open. Cormac Sallow stood there, his face illuminated by a handheld flare. The red light cast a hellish glow over his weathered features, making him look like a demon rising from the rock. In his hand he held a heavy iron wrench, stained with something dark and viscous. "You talk too much, Mr. Gaunt," Sallow growled. "You and your charts and your logic. You think you can solve the mountain like a math problem. But the mountain doesn't have a solution. It only has an end." Isolde shrank back, but Gaunt stood his ground, the star chart still clutched in his hand. "The Pomeroy shard wasn't just a mine, was it, Cormac? Your brother didn't just fall. He was murdered because he found out what Thistlewood was really doing in the Andes. And you've been waiting 20 years for him to come to your mountain." Sallow didn't deny it. "Leopold thought he was the master of the peak. He thought he could build his glass house on my brother's grave. I didn't kill him for money, and I didn't kill him for a pension. I killed him because he was a cancer on the rock." "But you didn't do it alone," Gaunt said, his eyes narrowing. "The pressure cycling, the star charts, the subtle sabotage of the oxygen, that requires an intellect you don't possess, Cormac. You're the hand, but who is the head?" Sallow laughed, a bitter rattling sound. "The head is the one who was tired of being a shadow, the one who realized that if Leopold died, the Thistlewood Prime discovery would be buried forever, and the mountain would be left in peace." From the shadows behind Sallow, a second figure emerged. It was Oswald Fennel, but he was no longer the servile, stooped secretary. He stood tall, his eyes bright with a cold, terrifying lucidity. He held a small silver remote control, the override for the building's atmospheric systems. "A perfect partnership, Mr. Gaunt," Fennel said, his voice silky and dangerous. "Mr. Sallow provided the physical access and the historical vengeance. I provided the technical execution. Together we have ensured that Leopold's great silence is exactly that. Silent, permanently." "And Blythe?" Gaunt asked. "Why poison the girl?" "A necessary redundancy," Fennel replied casually. "She is a Thistlewood. If she lived, the corporation would continue. The surveying would resume. To save the mountain, the bloodline must end. It's a matter of ecological hygiene." "You're insane," Isolde whispered. "No, Doctor," Fennel said, stepping into the red light of the flare. "We are simply the only ones who understand the scale of the desecration. Now, I'm afraid the pressure in this room is about to become unsustainable. The storm is our accomplice. When they find your bodies, it will be called an atmospheric accident, a tragedy of the heights." He pressed a button on the remote. A low, ominous hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. The high-pitched whine returned, louder than ever, a scream of thin air that promised only the void. Gaunt looked at the star charts, then at the two men standing in the doorway. He was trapped in a library with a scientist, a killer guide, and a genocidal secretary, as the very air he breathed turned into a weapon. "The glass reflects only what we want to see," Gaunt quoted, his voice barely audible over the mechanical roar. "But the shadow is where the truth resides, and your shadow, Oswald, is far longer than you think." The fifth chapter of the Zenith of Silence ended as the library windows began to groan under the artificial pressure, the glass spider webbing with cracks that looked like the very constellations Thistlewood had tried to steal. The mountain was coming for them all, and the architect of the truth had only one move left to play. The vibration was no longer a sound, it had become a physical entity, a predatory hum that resonated within the very marrow of Cyprian Gaunt's bones. In the flickering, hellish crimson of Cormac Sallow's flare, the library of the Glass Observatory felt like the interior of a dying star, expanding toward a final catastrophic collapse. The air was thick with the scent of burning magnesium and the sharp, clinical tang of ozone. Gaunt stood at the center of the room, his long skeletal fingers resting lightly on the edge of the mahogany desk, his posture as poised as a conductor, awaiting the final movement of a symphony. Oswald Fennel, the man who had played the part of the invisible shadow for 12 years, stood by the door with the silver remote control gripped in a hand that did not tremble. Beside him, Sallow was a silhouette of jagged edges, the iron wrench hanging from his fist like a medieval mace. The pressure in the room was rising at a calculated, agonizing rate. Gaunt could feel the capillaries in his eyes beginning to ache, his vision fringed with a halo of iridescent blue, a symptom of the atmospheric manipulation Fennel was orchestrating. "You speak of hygiene, Oswald," Gaunt began, his voice cutting through the mechanical roar with the precision of a scalpel. "But there is nothing clean about what you have done. You have taken the majesty of this mountain and turned it into a slaughterhouse. You didn't just kill a man, you attempted to murder the very concept of the truth." "The truth is a luxury for those who live in the valleys, Mr. Gaunt," Fennel replied, his voice devoid of its former servile cadence. It was now a cold, academic instrument, Up here, at the zenith, the only truth is survival. Leopold Thistlewood was a parasite who intended to hollow out this peak for the sake of a few more zeros on a ledger. I have merely acted as the mountain's immune system, by using its physics as your weapon, Gaunt countered. He turned slightly, gestured toward the cracked glass of the library windows, where the storm lashed against the panes like 1,000 frantic hands. The impossible crime in the crow's nest. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, I will grant you that. You knew that the triple reinforced glass and the locked door would create a vacuum of logic. You knew that we would look for a killer who walked through the door. But you, Oswald, you are a man of systems. You realize that the observatory's climate control was designed to maintain a precise pressure differential between the interior and the lethal Alpine atmosphere outside. Gaunt began to pace, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the floor. At 11:30 p.m., while the rest of us were retreating from the storm, you and Salo were already in position. You didn't need to be in the room with Leopold. You simply had to be at the controls. You increased the internal pressure in the crow's nest to nearly 3 atmospheres, a dangerous level, but one the glass could sustain for a short period. Then, using the master override, you triggered a sudden, explosive decompression through the ventilation shafts. The air didn't just rush out, it became a gale. It was that force, that artificial hurricane within the room that propelled the ice pick, weighted specifically and aimed through a guide rail you had secretly installed in the ceiling vent, directly into Thistlewood's chest. Salo's grip on the wrench tightened. "You're guessing, Detective. You can't prove a breath of air." "I don't need to prove the air, Cormac. I have already proven the frost," Gaunt said, stopping his pace to look Salo directly in the eye. The Joel-Thompson effect. When that pressure dropped instantly, the temperature in the room plummeted far below the freezing point of the ambient moisture. The frost formed in a microsecond, a silver shroud over everything, and then you simply walked in through the now unlocked door, unlocked because the pressure sensor had failed, and retrieved your guide rail. You didn't leave footprints because you didn't have to. You stepped onto the leather chair, which remained dry due to its oil-treated surface, and exited before the frost had even fully crystallized. You were a ghost created by a barometer. The wind outside gave a particularly violent shriek, and for a moment the library felt as though it were tilting into the abyss. Dr. Penhaligon, huddled in the corner with her chemical lamp, looked up at Gaunt with a mixture of terror and awe. "The high-pitched whine," she whispered. "It was the pumps, the vacuum pumps cycling the air." "Exactly, Doctor," Gaunt said. "The sound of thin air was the sound of the murder in progress. But Oswald's genius was also his downfall. He is a man who cannot stand disorder. He tried to clean up the scene by poisoning Blythe. Not because he hated her, but because her presence was a variable he couldn't control. She was the heir. She represented the continuation of the Thistlewood legacy. To Oswald, she was a loose thread in an otherwise perfect tapestry. Fennel's face darkened, the first sign of genuine emotion breaking through his icy exterior. "She was a wasted life, Mr. Gaunt. A trophy of a dead era. The mountain deserves better than to be inherited by a girl who views it as a backdrop for her boredom. And who are you to decide the worth of a life?" Gaunt stepped forward, ignoring the mounting pressure that made his head feel as though it were clamped in a vice. "You are not the mountain, Oswald. You are a man who has spent too much time in the thin air, and it has rotted your perspective. You think you are saving the peak, but you are just another conqueror. Thistlewood wanted its minerals. You want its silence. Both of you are willing to kill to get what you want." Salo took a step toward Gaunt, the red flare in his hand sputtering, casting long, rhythmic shadows that looked like the beating of wings. "Enough talk. The pressure is at the red line, Oswald. One more cycle, and the seals in this room will blow. We'll be found in the spring, frozen into the marble. A tragedy of the heights, just like you said." "Is that your plan, Cormac?" Gaunt asked, his voice low and dangerous. "To die for a man who views you as a blunt instrument? Oswald hasn't told you everything, has he? He hasn't told you that the remote in his hand isn't just an override for the pressure. It's a detonator for the auxiliary oxygen tanks in the sub-level. He doesn't intend for any of us to be found, including you. He wants the zenith of silence to be a literal tomb, buried under 1,000,000 tons of triggered avalanche. Sallow froze. He turned his head slowly toward Fennel, his eyes narrowing. Is that true, Oswald? We had a deal. We reclaim the mountain, then we disappear into the valley. The valley is full of people like Thistlewood, Cormac, Fennel said, his voice now high and thin, vibrating with a manic energy. There is no disappearance. There is only the ascent. To truly save the peak, we must become part of it. We must be the legends that haunt the glass. It is the only way to ensure no one ever returns. You're mad, Sallow breathed, the wrench slipping an inch in his hand. You're as crazy as the wind. In that moment of hesitation, Gaunt acted. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for the star chart on the desk. With a flick of his wrist, he threw the heavy, metallic-inked parchment into the sputtering flame of Sallow's flare. The reaction was instantaneous. The minerals in the ink, designed by Thistlewood to be light-sensitive and highly conductive, ignited with a blinding, violet flash. The sudden brilliance acted like a physical blow in the darkened, pressurized room. Sallow cried out, clutching his eyes. Fennel staggered back. Momentarily blinded by the chemical flare, Gaunt lunged forward, his lean frame moving with a surprising, predatory speed. He bypassed Sallow and slammed into Fennel, his shoulder connecting with the secretary's chest. The two men crashed to the floor, the silver remote skittering across the marble. "The remote, Doctor! Get the remote!" Gaunt shouted, his hands grappling with Fennel's surprisingly strong grip. "Doctor." Penhaligon scrambled across the floor, her fingers brushing the silver device just as Sallow, recovered from the flash, raised his wrench for a killing blow. "Stop!" Penhaligon screamed, her thumb hovering over the primary button of the remote. "If you strike him, I'll press it. I'll vent the entire level into the void. We'll all be gone before his body hits the floor." The mountain guide paused, the iron wrench trembling in the air, the red light of the dying flare reflected in his eyes, revealing a man caught between his ancient rage and the primal instinct to survive. He looked at the doctor, then at the struggling figures of Gaunt and Fennel on the floor. The silence that followed was the truest zenith they had yet encountered. It was the silence of a heartbeat, of a breath held too long, of a world suspended between the solid rock and the infinite sky. Suddenly, the mechanical whine that had plagued the building for hours changed its tone. It didn't rise, it fell. The vibration in the floorboards smoothed out into a steady, low-frequency hum. The pressure in Gaunt's ears equalized with a painful pop. From the corridor, a new sound emerged, the heavy rhythmic thud of the Teleferico's docking mechanism. The storm had not broken, but it had shifted, providing a narrow window of atmospheric stability. And with the stability came the sound of human intervention. "The gendarmerie," Gaunt panted, pinning Fennel's arms to the floor. "I sent a distress signal via the star chart's frequency before the power went out. I used the observatory's own surveying laser to pulse a Morse code into the valley. Thistlewood's greed provided the tools for his own justice." The library doors burst open, but it wasn't the police. It was the wind, a final defiant gust that blew out the last of the candles and the dying flare. In the darkness, the sounds of a struggle continued for a few seconds, then subsided. When the emergency lights of the mountain rescue team finally illuminated the room 10 minutes later, they found a scene of grim, crystalline order. Oswald Fennel was slumped against a bookshelf, his face a mask of profound disappointment, as if the universe had failed to live up to his calculations. Cormac Sallow sat on the floor, his head in his hands, the iron wrench lying discarded by his side. Cyprian Gaunt stood by the window, watching the first light of a cold gray dawn touch the peaks of the Mont Blanc Massif. The storm was receding, leaving behind a world of blinding virginal white. Blythe Pomeroy, pale but conscious, was being led into the room by a medic, her charcoal robe trailing on the floor like a shadow. "It's over," Dr. Penhaligon said, stepping up beside Gaunt. She looked out at the mountain she had spent her life trying to understand. The mountain is safe. For now. The mountain was never in danger, Doctor, Gaunt replied, his voice weary but resonant. It has been here for millions of years. It will be here long after the Glass Observatory has crumbled into dust. It was our own humanity that was at risk. We looked into the glass and saw only our own desires. Leopold saw gold. Oswald saw a sanctuary. Sallow saw a grave. None of them saw the mountain for what it actually is. "And what is it, Mr. Gaunt?" Blythe asked, her voice small and fragile in the vastness of the room. Gaunt turned away from the window, his sharp features softened by the morning light. "It is a reminder, Miss Pomeroy, a reminder that at 3,000 meters the air is too thin for lies. We are all just guests here, held on sufferance by a gravity we did not create and cannot control." He walked toward the door, pausing to look at the body of Leopold Thistlewood, which was being carried out in a black shroud. The zenith of silence had been reached, the debt had been paid, and the shards of the past had been swept away. As Gaunt stepped into the cable car for the descent back to the world of men, he felt the weight of the mountain lifting from his shoulders. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of glass. A fragment from the crow's nest. He held it up to the light. It was clear, sharp, and utterly indifferent to the tragedies it had witnessed. The descent began. The Glass Observatory receded into the clouds, a tiny, glittering speck of human vanity perched on the edge of the infinite. Cyprian Gaunt closed his eyes, listening to the rhythmic groan of the cables. The case was closed, the architecture of the crime dismantled, but as the air grew thicker and the scent of the valley rose to meet him, he knew that the silence of the Aiguille du Midi would remain with him, a cold, crystalline memory of the night the stars were almost stolen.